All right then. So welcome everyone. Thanks for coming. Hannes asked me to open this meeting because he thought he might not be able to make it in time today. Now he actually did make it, but I'll open the meeting anyways. So we will reverse the usual order of things today and start with a talk and then get to the general part later, in which Hannes wants to address the open letter with which we support Spain's stance against the war on Iran. Our speaker today is Tom Sauer. He's professor of international politics at Antwerp University, where one of his focuses is nuclear arms control. He has received, among other honors, fellowship from Harvard, Johns Hopkins, and the Rotary Alumni Global Service Award. He is an active advocate for peace with Pax Christi and the International Institute of Peace. Tom Sauer will discuss the reactions of European policymakers on the Ukraine war, the rise of China, and the withdrawal of the US from Europe. He will also consider ways forward for Europe from the current situation. So, Professor Sauer, we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Denise. I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
And I will start with uploading my PowerPoint. Do you see it? And do you see it moving? Yeah. Okay. So welcome and good evening for everybody. I'm talking from Japan, where I'm on a sabbatical this academic year. So no teaching, only time for research. And I'm writing a new book, a Dutch-speaking book, as I'm a Belgian, Flemish, on the topic that I will deliver today. And so this is the menu. I will start with a short introduction, and then I come to describe the turbulent world, as we know, and I will end with the consequences for Europe. So I think many people in the world are surprised what is happening, especially in the United States, but not only in the United States, and wonder what kind of president we have for the moment. Donald Trump, I'm not a psychologist, but he can be defined as a macho, sexist, racist. He has no values, or is not guided by values in his personal life and not his political life. He always wants to win. He also tries to enrich himself and his family, even when he's president. So you can say that he is corrupt. He is very narcissistic, wants to be respected, not only as a person, but also as a country. And according to Fiona Hill, who was an advisor on Russia in the first Trump administration, he has an inferiority complex. He also wants to centralize the decision-making in the White House, so he cannot delegate, and he doesn't like the bureaucracy in DC. He's not the only one in the United States on this point. Most of the Americans want a small state, small bureaucracy. But it must be frustrated in the State Department and the Pentagon nowadays, because most of the decisions are made in the White House by himself, with all the advantages and disadvantages. I think he sees more or less everything in a zero-sum game. What we win will others lose, and vice versa. He can be regarded as being transactional. He always wants something back from the other, and the goal justifies the means. So in his view, he can lie, he can use fake news, he can manipulate, and he wants to be seen as unpredictable. It's a strategy. At the same time, we have war going on in Europe, in particular in Ukraine, a war started by Russia, Mr. Putin, in 2022, and it already started in 2014, in fact, between 2014 and 22. Already 14,000 people died in the eastern part of Ukraine. And the combination of these two elements, the war in Ukraine and the feeling of abandonment in Europe by the United States, the main protector during the Cold War and thereafter of Europe, led to a shock in Europe, a psychological shock, which is still there in the general public, but also at the elite level. Here is a quote by the number 2 of the Belgian army. He's now retired, but he said a couple of months ago, the world we knew lies in ruins. The worldview of an unbreakable transatlantic bond, one which I myself grew up, is now history. And there are no rational arguments to explain this rupture. I must admit that I do not agree with this last sentence. I will try to give you a rational explanation for what is happening nowadays in this turbulent world. And maybe I start with a prediction by Francis Fukuyama, beginning of the 1990s, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, beginning of the post-Cold War period. He wrote a book, first an article, then a book called The End of History and The Last Man, in which he predicted that all states will try to become democratic and use a capitalist economy. And this there would not be something better than this combination of democracy and capitalism. That was his view, and that was his prediction. And his book was a bestseller. But he was, in the end, proven wrong. So, turbulency nowadays, especially if we compare with earlier periods, the Cold War, in comparison with today's world, is regarded as stable. It was a bipolar situation between East and West, the USSR on the one hand, and the United States on the other hand, and each having an alliance, a military alliance, the Warsaw Pact and NATO. And then, besides that, there was the so-called Third World that did not want to belong to one of these blocs, and their proxy wars happened, where these were wars indirectly fought by the USSR and the United States in other places, like in Vietnam, Korea, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Angola, Mozambique, and so on. So there have been many people who died in the Cold War. So from that perspective, it was not so stable. Now, inside the West, in the Western Bloc, we can see the European integration starting in 1951 with the European Community of Coal and Steel between France and Germany, and the Benelux countries and Italy. And later on became the European Community and European Union. And this is a prime example of supranational cooperation, which is rather unique in the world. Multilateralism, deep engagement, which led to welfare and stability in Europe. And then we got the end of the Cold War. Not many people had predicted this. In 1989, with the fall of the Berlin Wall, and then the implosion of the USSR and the Warsaw Pact at the end of 1991. And basically, only one superpower was left, namely the United States. So we arrived in a unipolar world instead of the bipolar world that we knew from the Cold War. So there was hegemony, global hegemony by one state, namely the United States. And we can, of course, discuss, but I think most observers would agree that this was a rather benign hegemon. It could have been much worse. Now, then the problem started at a certain moment in time, already in the 1990s. And the source of the turbulence, in my view, is twofold. One is what I call hubris by the United States, both idealistically and realistically inspired. And more in particular, the start of long and expensive military interventions, and more in particular in Afghanistan and Iraq after 9/11, which costed a lot of money, trillions of dollars for the United States, and hundreds of thousands of people who died, both in Afghanistan and Iraq. Locals, a couple of thousands of American soldiers as well. And then, at the same time, there was NATO expansion to the east, leading to more and more frictions and eventually war with Russia. Yeah, that can also be regarded as a kind of hubris by the United States, believing that Russia, that was weakened in the 1990s, would not react. But this is in the end proven mistaken. Russia did react, especially after the expansion of NATO of Ukraine in 2008. I think I gave already a lecture on this before. And then the second source of turbulence, besides the fact that the United States became overextended, is the rise of China. First economically, and nowadays also politically and militarily. And this means that there is something going on in the world, objectively speaking, namely a change in the so-called balance of power between the giants, United States, China, Russia, and Europe, and others. Some may include India, Japan. We can discuss which states belong to these regional powers in the world. And we see a start of many crises. So those who were born in the beginning of the 2000s, they only have known crisis, basically. It started with 9/11, followed by, and I'm talking now from the American point of view, Afghanistan, a war that took 20 years, so double as long as the Vietnam War. Iraq then in 2003, also by the Bush Jr. administration, also took a long time. The financial economic crisis that started in the United States, 2008, 2009. The fall of the Lehman Brothers bank, and then spill over to Europe. I will come back to that later on. Then, of course, we had COVID in the years 2020, 2019, 2020, 2021, 2022, with more than 1 million people died in the United States under Trump. So a lot of crises. And here you see how the GDP, so the economic power of a country, what the country produces, consumes in a year, how it changed over the period of decades from 1980 until today. And you see how it goes up and goes down for the United States. The United States was in the 80s by far the biggest country, economically speaking, in the world, more than 35% of world GDP. Nowadays, it still is the number one with 26, so it's going down. Then the other interesting one is the red one, is China, which is going up from the 1990s. And now China has more or less 17% of global GDP. Then our own continent in blue, Europe, is going down now at around the same percentage as China. and then the others are much lower. Here you see how, sorry, the economic growth of China was between 89 and 2018. It can be multiplied by 14, while for the average in the world was multiplied by 2. So China grew much faster than any other small or regional power in the world. The countries for which China is the largest trade partner became much bigger than countries for which America is the largest trade partner. And some anecdotes, some numbers. The last 20 years, China built 40,000 kilometer high velocity train kilometers. The United States only a couple of hundreds over the last 20 years. The train network in China, the high velocity train network, is double the size of the rest of the world nowadays. China leads in 37 of the 44 critical technologies nowadays. It delivers yearly more PhDs in STEM fields, in exact scientist fields, than the United States, 50,000 versus 34,000. And recently, BID, Chinese electric vehicle firm, has passed Tesla as the biggest electric vehicle car in the world. China produces nowadays more solar panels than the rest of the world combined. Then when President Xi came to power in 2012, 2013, he announced the BRE, the Belt and Road Initiative. 2 years later, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, a kind of alternative to the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank, based in China. There's the digital Silk Road with Huawei and ZTE, 2 telecom firms, China, possessing 40% of the world market. We have alternative to SWIFT, the banking interbank payment system based in Belgium. Now in China, an alternative that is already connecting 1,700 banks worldwide. It wants to become the number 1, economically speaking, in 2030, and the world leader in general in 2049. China. It wants its own currency, the yuan renminbi, as a reserve currency. Besides the dollar, 30% of the trade in goods with China is nowadays already carried out in the Chinese currency. But worldwide, it's only used for 2-3%. The dollar is still the reserve currency in the world. China wants, and it's more symbolic, go to the moon and come back. First, since the United States did it in 1972, and it wants to build a permanent base on the moon. It's prestige, and it wants its own internet. Here you see how China has overtaken the United States with respect to the number of principal combat ships already in 2015. And since 2012, the year that Xi came to power, more and more Americans are afraid of China, and there is an intellectual debate, academic debate, political scientists writing books like this one, A Contest for Supremacy, China, America, and the Struggle for Mastery in Asia by Aaron Friedberg from Princeton University. Nevertheless, there are a lot of questions left. Also, there are problems in China, economically speaking nowadays. Unemployment, not a lot of consumption, overproduction, and so on and so on. The question whether China will be a revisionist power in the future and change the borders, of trying to change the borders and make troubles in the neighborhood and beyond, or will it stay a status quo power? Question mark. Will China translate her economic and military power in a more assertive or even aggressive way with respect to foreign security policy in the future? Question mark. The hotspot, Taiwan. Will China take over Taiwan by using violence? I'm sure that Trump and Xi now gathering in China will talk about that as well these days. Will the economic growth that was at levels of 10% in the past, in 2007, then it slowed down, but nowadays still 4 or 5%, will continue? Question mark. It's still higher than in the United States, and in the United States it's higher than in Europe. Or will economic stagnation come up and lead to more demand for democracy, as people in China are not happy anymore with what's going on. It's an autocracy, it's not a democracy, they are not free. So nowadays, as long as the people see that their welfare improves, they're not making a lot of trouble, politically speaking, but would that change once the economy stops growing? Question mark. Now, what's very important here is the perception of a rising competitor in the United States, that perception in the United States in the period 2005, 2015, but it started already before, and it's continuing. But that will explain why a guy like Donald Trump was elected in 2015 for the first time. And many people in Europe do not understand why somebody like Donald Trump could be elected. My wife doesn't understand it, but I again will try to explain this in a more rational way. And you have to understand the issues that I've mentioned on this slide, a series of crises that already we went through, 9/11, Afghanistan, Iraq, the financial crisis, Corona, but not mentioned yet, a huge trade deficit with China since the Bush Jr. administration. Very important for Trump. Cared already about that in the 80s, and he wrote a book in the 80s. Then there's deindustrialization going on in the United States. So moving to services, but many jobs lost in the industry, car industry, for instance, partly because of globalization, and partly because of China. And increasing state debt, I will come back to that in a moment. You've a huge $40 trillion for the moment, and rising rapidly. Increasing socioeconomic inequality in the United States. Many people feel that they are forgotten by the elite, by the politicians in Washington, D.C. And polarization between the two big political parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, already since the mid-1990s, before they cooperated to a certain extent. After the mid-1990s, they basically cooperated. So it makes it politically much more difficult for American political decision makers. So here you see that the huge trade deficit in the United States, and it's going worse, both for goods and services in general, not specifically vis-à-vis China, but in general. And here you see the debt in 2020 already $30 trillion. Nowadays it's going up. It went up to $40 trillion. The economic inequality in the United States, here you see in orange, the top 1% of the population earning money, that is that part of the population is getting more and more income, as you can see. and much more than, for instance, the bottom 10% gets. So that's what, of course, is felt not so much in the East Coast and West Coast of the United States, but in the middle. Those are the people voting for Trump. Here you have the historian Niall Ferguson writing a book about the rise and fall of the American empire. So people are aware in the United States that China is rising and that the United States is declining, at least relatively speaking. And then on top of that, to explain why Donald Trump won in 2015 for the first time, are weak Democrats. Yeah? The Democrats also made mistakes. First Hillary Clinton, but then 8 years later also Biden, who didn't step down, very old, not healthy, confusing when he speaks, and so on. And then Kamala Harris, who at the end replaced Biden as the candidate for the Democrats, but probably too late, and nobody knows for what he stood. So the consequence of all this that I have described means that the zeitgeist in the United States was in favor of the election of somebody like Trump, a populist, promising a lot of things and his two major slogans were "Make America Great Again," saying that America was getting poorer and poorer, and the other slogan was "America First." These are not really original slogans because they have been used in the past, but it worked. With respect to foreign policy, he made clear as a candidate that he would not start long wars, like the Afghanistan and the Iraq wars. Basically, Obama promised that as well, and also did so. And also Trump, in his first administration, didn't start long wars. I come back to the second Trump administration in a minute. Then the first Trump administration, and before Obama, emphasized China because of what happened, and I just explained it. So-called pivot to Asia, pivoting away from Europe and the Middle East, where the United States was actively involved over the last decades. And policy of the United States is really becoming harder vis-à-vis China, de-risking. Some even talk about decoupling the economy from the Chinese economy, and having a containment policy by Biden, by Trump 1 administration vis-à-vis China. Try to contain China so that it cannot build up more. And less interest in the allies by Trump. That's new. Biden was still interested in allies, but under Trump, it's a radical change. Since decades, the United States helped the allies both in Europe and in Asia. Nowadays, that's over. So if we focus on the current Trump administration, it's basically more or less the same as the first Trump administration, except for China policy. And most important characteristic is that he's behaving unilateralist, meaning acting alone, not taking into account the interests and views of other states, like allies. He doesn't like cooperation with other states, doesn't like multilateralism, doesn't like international organizations like the EU, like NATO, like the United Nations. He doesn't like treaties, international treaties. He doesn't like the liberal order that was created by the United States after the Second World War. And he dislikes allies who he defines as weak and profiting from the United States. He didn't start long wars. We will see how long this Iran war will take, but he started short wars in the form of attacks against Nigeria, Yemen, Venezuela, Iran last year, and this year again. He seems to like, and he also explicitly says so, authoritarian right-wing, extreme right-wing leaders like Putin, the Chinese president, Xi, the Argentinian President Milei, Italian President Meloni, Prime Minister, and Orban, who's now gone. The sphere of influence of the United States is now defined as North, Middle, and South America. That's the most important region for the United States, according to the US National Security Strategy that came out at the end of last year. And that is also relatively new. This shift in his policy vis-à-vis China. In his first administration, he was very harsh vis-à-vis China. Nowadays, he's especially since October, when Xi and Trump met already, he is calming down. He apparently wants to have better relations with China, but we have to speak with two words when we're talking about Donald Trump, and we will see how this summit will end. Here we have a quote by the vice president when he was senator in 2024. We ought to view the money Europe hasn't spent on defense for what it really is, an implied tax on the American people to allow for the security of Europe. And that is also the view of Donald Trump. He believes that Europe and the other allies in Asia have misused the United States and did not give something back to the United States. He believes that the time that taxpayers of the United States have to pay for the security in Europe is over. Europe is rich enough, and maybe he has a point. So let me then come back to the last part, most extensive part, the consequences of all this for Europe. And here I would like to start with a quote by Mark Eskes. He's a former prime minister of my own country, a former minister of foreign affairs, Christian Democrat, saying in the beginning of the 1990s, already a long time ago, Europe is an economic giant, a political dwarf, and a military war. I think that nowadays Europe is still an economic giant, not much more than a political dwarf, but not a military war anymore. That has changed. Let's go to the numbers first and compare the EU with the United States and China. With respect to the GDP, the United States is number one, 29-30 billion dollars. China and the European Union follow with respectively 19 and 20. In purchasing power capacity, GDP, it's different. If you calculate it this way, and it means that you take into account how much the Chinese people can buy with the money they have. Of course, in China they can buy more than with the money in the United States. Then you end up with China being the number one already since 2015. But most observers believe that the best indicator for power is still GDP in nominal terms. And then the United States is still the number one. 50% more than China, basically. If you look to GDP per capita, Then, of course, taking into account the huge population of China, the average Chinese men and women are poorer than the Europeans, and Europeans are poorer than the average American. But here you should be aware that, again, there's a huge inequality in the United States. The top 1%, of course, makes that this number is very high in the United States. Growth percentages are the biggest in China, as I already said, 4 or 5% nowadays. In the United States, nearly 3%, and in Europe, lower, 1.5%. Life expectancy, in contrast, is higher in Europe. So it's much better. It's better to live in Europe than in the United States and China. People live longer in Europe. But maybe work less hard. We can discuss that. Population is much bigger in China, of course, but it's not the biggest anymore. India is now the number one. United States, 340 million, EU, in global, 450. And population growth is also different. The Chinese population goes down, so that's one of the other problems in China. Older people and less people able to pay for the pensions of the older people in China. The best is the United States, thanks to immigration, but the question is whether that will stay because of Trump. So Europe awakens in a rough, turbulent world as a result of what I already explained: aggressive Russia, a shock for us in 2022 when Russia invaded Ukraine, a regional power that invaded a smaller power behind a wall of 6,000 nuclear weapons, very cowardly, something we have never seen before, or we should go back to the Second World War in Europe. So nobody had expected that. We were living in a bubble, in my view, in Europe. We thought that the world was like Europe, where the power factor became less important. We cooperated, even on a supranational level in Europe. And what was important was peace, democracy, human rights, international law, and so on. And we apparently thought that the whole world was worked like that, which is, of course, a huge mistake by us Europeans, because the rest of the world never subscribed to our values, especially not Russia and China, with respect to democracy, rule of law, human rights, and so on. Apart from Russia invading Ukraine, we see at the same time the United States becoming rhetorically aggressive vis-à-vis Europe. Think about Ukraine and especially Greenland. I will come back to that since 2025, since the second Trump administration. And more people, including myself, wonder whether the United States can still be regarded as an ally and protector. And we in Europe have also seen our own series of crises. Let's go to them. And then, of course, there's the rise of China, which is for us in Europe a bit less important than for the United States, because the United States was number one, not Europe. So we have this financial economic crisis, spillover from the financial economic crisis in the United States in 2010, 2012. I remember the problems in the southern countries, the so-called PIGS countries, Portugal, Ireland, Greece, Spain. We had to spend a lot of money to rescue these states. We talking about the northern states, Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium. But we did it. The Crimea crisis then in 2014, the migration crisis because of the wars in the Middle East caused by the United States. The result were not for the United States. The negative impact was not for the United States, but was for Europe. Yeah? And as a result of that, of course, the rise of the right-wing parties started already before, but of course this was not helping. Terrorist attacks, also as a result of what was happening in the Middle East, in Belgium in 2016. The Brexit, same year. United Kingdom, the people voting there against remaining in the European Union. And the same year, so it's really annus horribilis, I think we can say, the election for the first time of President Trump in the United States. Not many people had expected that, including himself. So he was not really prepared in 2016. And he had still, we can say, moderate advisors, breaking his more radical views, which is not the case anymore nowadays with the second Trump administration. He learned his lesson. And also in Europe, of course, we got the COVID saga. And then in 2022, on top of that, the war in Ukraine by Russia. On top of that, the war in Gaza, more important in Europe because of the Arab population here in Europe. And then in 2024, the re-election of Trump. So he's not elected once; he was elected twice. So for those who do not understand why he has been elected, this is remarkable, and you should think twice why that was the case. Then his foreign policy since last year, and a lot has happened since last year. It was the longest year ever, some say, 2025. Already in the beginning of the year, he invited Russia to talk about the war in Ukraine. Personally, I think that was the right move to do. I mean, this war was already going on for 3-4 years. Every war, every conflict should be resolved by talking, by using diplomacy. But the Biden administration and the Europeans refuse to do so, which is something that I do not understand, and I think I have explained in another lecture. So when the Trump administration invited the Russians to talk, Putin said yes, to the surprise of many Europeans. They were also shocked, the Europeans, that they were not invited either. But I think they should not have be surprised because they were never interested in talking to Putin in the first place. So in this, I support fully the Trump administration. A couple of weeks later, in the White House, in the Oval Office incident between Trump and Zelensky, everybody remembers. It was again a shock, a second shock for the European leaders, that they were alone now in helping Ukraine. The United States was not interested anymore. That was clear. And indeed, the United States does not support financially Ukraine anymore, neither militarily. If Ukraine wants American weapons, Europeans have to buy it in the United States nowadays. Stephen Wall from Harvard calls it, referring to the tariffs he announced to many countries in the world, a predatory hegemon, in contrast to before, a benign hegemon. Then von der Leyen, with the deal on tariffs made in Scotland, where Trump was playing golf, remember, in the summer of 2025. But many observers have criticized the agreement and said that the European Union could have negotiated better. Then a couple of weeks later, the NATO summit, where the European countries agreed with the demand by President Trump to spend 5% on defense in the future. 5%, much more than before. At that time, we were even not spending 2%, in contrast to what we had promised in 2014. Now we are going to spend 5%, which is very, very much. Of the 5%, 3.5% should be core defense issues, and then 1.5% on other security priorities like building bridges and roads to transport all the military material if needed in times of war. And we have Mark Rutte, the former Dutch Prime Minister and now NATO Secretary General, using the word daddy when he talked to Donald Trump. Again, attitude that was not really appreciated by many Europeans. But it is, of course, not easy to deal with a guy like Trump, we must admit. And then another shock for the Europeans in the summer of last year, the meeting at the personal level between President Trump and President Putin, talking about the war in Ukraine, in Alaska, without Europeans. We saw the hybrid war going on further with drones ending up in Ukraine, in Poland. Many people thought that they saw drones, but later on appeared not to be drones, certainly not Russian drones. But that is what is going on in this atmosphere of fear and distrust. And of course, multiplied by the media, also the mainstream media in our countries. Then the end of last year, the National Security Strategy of the United States, with this interesting phrase about Europe. So the United States wants to meddle in our domestic politics, cultivating resistance to Europe's current trajectory within European nations. And they want to support the extreme right political parties. Something that is, of course, not done, and certainly not by an ally. And then the issue that probably really made a difference in the heads of the political leaders in the European Union was what happened with respect to Greenland. When the United States announced that it wanted to take over Greenland from Denmark, not only an EU member, but also a NATO member. That is, of course, crossing the red line by far. And at that time, in the beginning of 2026, most leaders in Europe, I think, give up on the United States, give up de facto on NATO. How did Europe react to all these crises? You see it in red and in green, so it's a mixed plate. They reacted divided on the financial economic crisis, later on united, but it took a lot of time. They used the so-called financial bazooka, and that resolved it. Economic sanctions after the Crimea crisis against Russia. That's, of course, the easiest thing to do. They were divided and are still divided on migration, united on Brexit. They accepted it, but what else could they do? On Corona, rather quickly united and using common budget, Eurobonds, which is new. And then in the war in Ukraine in 2022, they were united in giving humanitarian aid, also applying heavy economic sanctions and giving military aid. In the beginning, only helmets in Germany, but after a while, munition, more and bigger munition, F-16s, and nowadays even missiles. But, and that is, I think, very important to mention again, what was lacking is and was diplomacy, and still is today, more than 4 years after the start of the war, as if Europe agrees with this war going on forever. I will come back to that as well. The policy vis-à-vis China is divided, and that's good for China. On Ukraine and Trump, the combination of the two, I think we are more or less united in spending more on defense. What is also new is the French proposal to Europeanize the nuclear deterrent, French nuclear deterrent, since a couple of months, and the positive reactions by the German Chancellor and the Belgian Prime Minister, for instance, that is new. But again, diplomacy that is lacking. There was no reaction because we were divided in the European Union on Gaza and Iran. Yeah, it's a shame. Countries like Germany, the Netherlands, that for historical reasons do not want to criticize Israel, while others like Spain did criticize Israel from the beginning. And then on Trump's acceptivity, we are giving in the European Commission on tariffs and with respect to NATO on defense, paying much more, something that Trump would like to see. And finally, on Greenland, we were united in resistance. So the problem for Europe, and that's very important to understand, is that with respect to foreign policy, we have to decide with consensus. So all of the 27 states in the European Union have to agree on every issue. Otherwise, there's no decision possible. And most of the time, of course, because of the different national interests in the European Union, we are divided, and there is no policy as a result. And if we react, it's too late. For instance, with the financial economic crisis, with respect to migration, China, Gaza, Iran, and so many other examples. And in case there is a consensus, we end up with the lowest common denominator. For instance, in the Crimea. And like in the Ukraine war, we come up with a policy because of the East Europeans and Central Europeans, because they know Russia best. But then later on, we have difficulty to adjust our policy, even if the international circumstances change. And that's why we, for instance, nowadays still do not talk to Russia, because the East Europeans did not want it. While others like France, Spain, Belgium would like to see us talking to Putin to end this war. So the divisions inside the European Union are divisions between the national interests and deeper parochial and personal interests. For instance, the competition amongst firms that are nationally protected, for instance, defense firms. For instance, the best example, Germany and France are trying to build a European fighter plane, Dassault and Airbus, but they are constantly making troubles and the project is going nowhere. The same with regard to banks. The banks are protected by national interests, which makes that we don't have a banking union at the European level. Electricity firms that are protected in France, and so on and so on. Besides that, there's the left-right division, the classic division, with more protectionism, étatism in France versus the more free market vision in Germany. So many Americans, and also probably Russians and Chinese observers, believe that the EU are in difficulties and that they may become more divided and may even crumble once the United States withdraws from Europe completely. I do not agree. I think the EU is stronger than the United States and Russia and China believe. But let me come to how Europe should react in order not to be eaten by the other giants, big powers in the world. And then there are three options: soft power, hard power, or a mixture of the two. And here I refer to an interesting speech given by the Canadian Prime Minister in Davos this year, asking for diplomacy and cooperation among states. Now, the first option, soft power, was the option that Europe used before, with an emphasis on values, diplomacy, democracy, free trade, and rule of law. That was the core of the first European security strategy in 2003. Now, the criticism is, of course, that this is not sufficient anymore in this changing world with changing balances of power, in this hard world. We need coercive diplomacy, we need economic sanctions, we need defense, and so on and so on. And we should be careful of being not too dependent on others, like on Russia with respect to energy, but nowadays on the United States with respect to energy. So that is a problem. The other extreme, and that's where we are heading for nowadays, is hard power. And we need hard power to a certain extent. We need strategic autonomy, being able to act regardless of Russia, regardless of the United States, regardless of China. And we should, of course, de-risk, making the risk smaller in trading and investing with other regional powers. And we should have our own defense. I agree, but now it comes. I think we are going too much in the direction of defense, spending too much on defense. And as a result, every euro can only spend once. So every euro spent on defense cannot be spent on the economy, on social security, on education, on research and development, on climate, and many other things. And if we spend more on defense, of course, our neighbors, read Russia, will also, of course, follow our example. So it's too one-sided, our current policy, too defensive. And again, we need to use also foreign policy tools, not only military tools, and more in particular diplomacy on a European level. And the first task is to use it vis-à-vis Russia. Now, there is still too little democratic control in the European Union because there's no political union. And there's still the risk of a crumbling world economy if every state, every regional power will start going to use in a protectionist way. These are the Belgian defense expenditures, just an example, how it rose tremendously last year to 2%. So we are spending, instead of 8 billion euros nowadays, 13 billion euros per year, 5 billion more. I know that Germany, the Netherlands and Germany are spending much, much more. Here you have the budget deficit in Belgium at the same time, increasing, and it applies probably to other states as well, 4 to 6% nowadays. And we see it as not only spending more money on defense, but in general, the secularization of our societies. Talking about citizens that have to buy emergency packages with radio transistors and with water in-house to prepare for a possible war. So people are getting afraid if they hear that and if they have to buy these packages. In Belgium, there are now defense courses organized, given in secondary schools. There's a new defense course developed at university level, including war medicine, from next academic year onwards. Universities and think tanks, and that's in Belgium first, can now also go for defense research and development. I think Hannes has already talked about that in previous weeks or months or years. We have in Belgium now so-called defense houses in every city. And banks in Belgium are now investing again in nuclear weapons businesses. So it's all going in the wrong direction. While, objectively speaking, the defense expenditures in Europe were already high and are becoming much higher. We were spending in a couple of years ago $400 billion on defense, only the European NATO member states. That includes the United Kingdom and Turkey and Norway, but excludes the United States. While if you add the United States, you end up with $1,500 billion per year spent on defense, while Russia spends 10 times less per year. 10 times less in comparison with NATO, and 4 times less in comparison with European NATO member states. Already a couple of years ago, and now we promised to go to 5%. And are already at $560 billion a year. So that's, I think, not proportional anymore. Here you see what we bought with all this money, much more than Russia. So generals that are saying that that because of the peace dividend we were weaker than Russia, they are simply wrong. These numbers date from a couple of years ago, and NATO has a much more military personnel than Russia, more armored units, more fighter planes, more ships, and the same number of nuclear weapons. Even if you compare the European NATO members, we have more tanks, more armed vehicles, more artillery, more helicopters, more ships, and so on and so on, more personnel than Russia. Already nowadays. Russia only has more bombers and military satellites. And if you only look to the EU members, you see how the defense budget is going up since 2016, 2017. And I wonder why there are so few critical voices against this war narrative and the defense budget increases in Europe. And I wonder what the role is of mainstream social media in this. So option 3, that's my the one that I prefer. It's a balance between soft and hard power. We need sufficient hard power, but without exaggerating. And very important nowadays, power is seen more and more in terms of technology, AI, nano, quantum, biotech, semiconductors. Those states that score high on these elements, they may become the powerful nations in the future, probably more important than military power, and at the same time energy, as we know. Combining it with soft power and cooperation with other states, other regional powers, including China and Russia, but also the United States and the rest of the world, the BRICS countries, to be able to tackle global threats like climate change, pandemics, proliferation, and others. And economically, I think we should find a balance between an open economy and being too much dependent on others. And with respect to security, I think we should also cooperate in Europe with Russia, and ideally also on a global level with the others. Going back on the EU, I think we should work further, elaborate further, integrate further the internal market, which is not finished. There are 44% non-tariff trade barriers for goods amongst the member states. So we are always complaining about Trump and the tariffs, but inside Europe there is this problem of non-tariff trade barriers that we can resolve by our own. Yeah? And for services, it's even higher. I don't know whether I have time to go in the policies of Europe vis-à-vis United States, Russia, and China. I'm looking to Denise, whether I should stop and go for Q&A or whether I can continue.
I mean, maybe these would actually be good topics to discuss more interactively in the Q&A, if you would agree.
Okay, yeah. But let me finish then just by saying that I think the European Union should integrate further, like the Draghi report recommended last year or the year before, with a banking union, a capital union, a defense union also, but not with more money. But I think we need a European army that, and instead of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, I think that's gone. There's still a building in Belgium, a NATO building, and NATO officials going to the building every day, but it's empty. It's an empty shell, NATO. Nobody trusts the United States, that the United States will come to Europe and support us militarily speaking when we are attacked, for instance, by Russia. Although I do not believe that Russia will attack us. But the most logical thing is to organize defense by the Europeans. And very important, another layer with Ukraine and Russia, in a collective security organization like the OSCE, the Organization for Cooperation and Security in Europe, as an alternative to NATO. And the difference between the two is that NATO is a military alliance against an external threat, a collective defense organization. We do not need that anymore, especially if there's a European army, and especially if we cooperate with Russia. But we need a collective security organization like the OSCE that includes not only Ukraine but Russia, and that tries to resolve problems with respect to war and peace by talking, by making rules and agreements in advance. And that may include a kind of collective defense instrument, but not against an external threat, but vis-à-vis the member states. I think I gave already a lecture on this before, but if people have questions on that, I can come back to that as well. Do you want me to stop sharing the slides, or?
I mean, you can still share them if they would support the
Yeah, maybe I can show you
to keep them on.
some of the next slides if need.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Okay, then thank you so much for this very comprehensive presentation. I would suggest we move on to a discussion within the group then, and I will hand over to Hannes for moderating the discussion.